I'm going to say that one more time because it was crazy to me when I finally realized this. The food that you eat, everything that you consume turns into the chemicals that your brain uses to function. That's pretty cool.
On the ExpertsConnect podcast, we have thought-provoking conversations with top-performing experts on topics that matter to you. With ExpertsConnect, you'll uncover fascinating facts and gain the necessary skills you'll need to improve all aspects of your life. Dr. Sarah Levin Allen is a working mom, pediatric neuropsychologist, and parent-teacher coach. She's on a mission to help parents raise happy brains. As the Brain Gal, she teaches people how to use brain science to their advantage. She started her practice, Brain Behavior Bridge, to help translate the neuroscience research to everyday life and help people access it. Dr. Allen uses these brain tips and tricks to help you find who you are, who your children are, and what your values are so you can raise happy brains at home, in the classroom, and the community. As a mother and professional, she's interested in helping kids directly and supporting the people who raise and educate them. Hi, Sarah. How are you doing today?
Oh, good. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. And Dr. Sarah Levin Allen, you are a pediatric neuropsychologist. Could you share a bit more about your background?
Sure, absolutely. So as you said, I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist, and really what that means is I'm a brain gal. That's kind of what I say at parties because everyone just asks you, what does that mean? Or I don't know what that is. And so I just say I'm a brain gal, which then they usually inevitably will say something like, what am I thinking? Or something like that. But other than that, I really just describe it as I look at brain and behavior relationships. And in my particular case, I have a big focus on helping parents and teachers raise happy, connected little brains. And I know that sounds weird because most people think they're raising kids, but in my mind, the way I see the world, they're raising just these little brains. And so that's primarily what I focus on.
Beautiful. And we're going to talk about the brain. So can you please quickly give us an overview of the brain?
Sure. So the brain is really set up where you have two different hemispheres that work to connect and to communicate. And I often say there's these things I call brain rule, life rules. So we work a lot on connection and communication in our life, while the brain is primarily set up to work on communication and connection. Besides those two hemispheres, then we also have 4 different lobes that are kind of on the outside of the brain. And then the things that are really important for our functioning, things like learning and memory and emotions, are deeper inside the brain. They're very protected. And so it's a great kind of thing to have these things deep inside the brain and then have these outer structures. And we used to think of the brain a little more focally, like a little more like these different parts of the brain would do different things. And now our focus is a lot more on pathway and connections. For example, there's a pathway that runs from the front of our brain to the center or the emotion center of our brain and back. And that pathway is especially important for both kids as we're helping to raise these little brains, what's happening with them. And if you're a parent, it's the emotion center of your brain is also very important when it comes to being a parent as well. And so the brain really runs our body and our mind, and it creates our reality. My mother always used to say, it's not reality, it's perception. And she couldn't be more on. She was talking more about social interactions with peers, but again, another brain rule, life rule, your brain really creates that reality.
Yeah. Interesting. Your brain creates your reality. So my perception could be different from my reality. Is that correct?
Well, your perception is your reality in a lot of ways. So your perception is your reality. The person sitting right next to you has a different perception and a different reality. So everybody walking in the world would have a different reality based on the way that their brain put together that perception.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about brain development in children. Why are these early years so important for brain development in our kids?
Oh, I love this question because prior to the age of 5 is the most learning that you will ever have across your lifespan. Kids are born with more than twice the amount of neurons that adults have when they're born. And they go through this process between about 0 and 5 where they start to, we call it pruning. Think of it kind of like branches in a tree, right? And they start to lose the neurons that they're not using, and they start to keep the ones that they are using. And so they go through this pruning process, and it's all kind of based on what they experience. So it's so interesting to me that these little kids have so many neurons. And again, about the brain, it's not about more. More isn't always better. And in this case, it's not better. What you want is more efficient and effective connections with the neurons that you currently have. So with these neurons or these cells in the brain, they have branches that come off that connect with other neurons. And what you really want is, again, these pathways, these connection points, these communication points in the brain, and less about having a lot. Actually, we know kids with autism have too many neurons. That would be one issue that they have. And we need to get more pathway, more efficiency in in the way that they can function. And so for early development, it's very, very, very important to have a lot of these experiences prior to the age of 5 and to really be able to help kids learn at that point.
Great. Could you explain what you mean again by pathways?
Sure, sure. So again, we used to think more like this part of the brain for the amygdala, for example, is in our emotion center of the brain, that that's the only thing that did emotion, or that the hippocampus, which is really close to the amygdala, is about learning and memory. And that's the only place learning and memory was created. But now we know a part like the hippocampus is really responsible for helping to initiate those kinds of memories. It kind of gets the process started, but they're stored in all different parts of the brain. And when we go to do something like speak, like I'm doing now, that is a full brain activity. So that's a much more of a pathway. It's not one particular part, but creating kind of the way to do something or creating that pathway. And so that's what we're really interested in, is this functional communication or functional output.
Great. Thanks for clarifying. What do infants and toddlers need for optimal brain development?
So I mentioned exposure, and primarily this is what they need for optimal development, which would be the experience and exposure to sensations, to interactions with other people, to language, to visual stimulation. We really focus, interestingly enough, on control during development. And we don't think of things this way, but when you think from a brain perspective, when we're looking at the development of kids, one of the first things we look at is the way that they can control their motor movements, right? We look for crawling or walking, which is a very controlled motor move. Have you ever watched a little infant or toddler try to kind of get themselves moving, roll over? They have to have a lot of muscle control. Then we look at kind of a pincer grasp to see if they can grasp food. And we know then that they're probably going to be able to swallow it because they have those motor skills developed. And so we start to kind of think about motor development first, and then we have development over thoughts and over language, right? So something like ba, 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 da, da, da becomes dad, or mom. That's a lot of control, right? And so we start to think of that. And then as kids get from to preschool, for example, if they're in a preschool setting, we start to focus on kind of these school readiness skills, like sitting in one place for more than 10 seconds. That's a very difficult thing for a young kid to learn, but they start to learn how to sit on a mat, or how to, talk to their friends, how to control their emotions, and all of these things start to help for them to develop their brains. So it's really about the focus on these exposures to these things, and then starting to teach these control methods in all those domains, because control isn't a separate spot for each domain. It's one part of our brain. It's the frontal lobe that we are trying to develop. We try to develop that all the way out through the early 20s, probably more if you know any adults. And so, in here, this infant and toddler years, we're really trying to set them up for success for the rest of their lives by teaching them some of these skills.
I love it. Thank you. And what happens to the brain as the child gets older?
So again, they're working on these connections, right? I'm reminding everybody about creating efficient and effective forms of communication and behavior. Our brain really works on a couple certain different principles, 3 in particular that I like to talk about after studying the brain for as many years as I have. Their anticipation, categorization, and control. These are the three main ways our brain seems to work. So our brain wants to anticipate things. It's always a step ahead of us. And we stop when things are surprising to us or when something doesn't go that way. But if you notice, you're probably already hearing the end of my sentence before I finish my sentence. And many times kids will go to do something before you finished what you said, or even you go to do something before that. It's because your brain anticipates. It's supposed to. You want it to, because it has to be ready to go when you need it.
Yeah.
The second principle is categorization. And that's really what we do. We categorize and group people. This is one of the reasons that we have so many issues with things like prejudice and things like racial issues. It's because our brain naturally categorizes and groups things. But once we know that, we can talk more about how the categorization that everybody is interesting and cool instead of they're not different. They're not different doesn't mean something to the brain because we categorize and group. We also do that with anything we're learning. So any information we learn gets categorized and grouped with other information we already know. So learning is really this process more of finding what we already know and putting the new information on top of that. And again, once you learn that kind of information as your child gets older, that's the basis for learning. So now we know we have to find where people are to bring them where we want them to be. And then finally, control, as I mentioned earlier, which is really fine tuning all of the outputs that come out of the brain. So, it takes a lot less brain power to control, to let things go than it does to control things. This is why we give kids with ADHD, stimulants. It doesn't make sense sometimes. They're already stimulated. They might be bouncing off the walls, either cognitively or behaviorally. Why would we stimulate them? It's because it takes more brain power. Dopamine, which is one of the chemicals our brain uses to communicate, it takes more dopamine to control and hold back than it does to just kind of let loose. So control is always something we're working on. And as I mentioned, control we work on way through our early 20s, probably all the way through lifespan. Sometimes I'm still working on control, especially when I'm parenting my children. So our brain wants to be able to anticipate what's happening, categorize that new information, and then control those responses. So as kids get older, it's really just a matter of working on those basic skills to help them learn and build their skills.
Very enlightening, Sarah. So let's talk about caring for the emotional brain. How are the mind and the brain related?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about this earlier, but I love this concept, right? Mind and brain. It's not one that we often make in neuroscience. We used to talk a lot about this. But as I mentioned before, it's not reality, it's perception, right? So our brain makes up what we would consider our mind. And so thinking is really just a function of the learning our brain does in the world. So when we it's based on this experience and the exposure that we have and that we've created. So our mind is really just a manifestation of this kind of perception of this learning.
Thank you, because I've always wondered if the mind and the brain are the same thing. So thanks for that clarification. And how can we as parents instill a growth mindset in our children?
So because our mind is driven from these experiences and from this exposure, we really need to expose our children to a growth mindset approach very early. So growth mindset meaning that we are flawed, but we grow and change from that, and not a fixed mindset where we're born this way and that is it. So we really want to have this growth mindset approach. I like to use something called a glow and grow chart, for example, to do this for our kids. And to be honest, it's very helpful for us too, because this creates a mindset for growth. So a glow and grow chart would be identifying the places you glow, where you're really rocking life, where you're just amazing right now. And then the places that you need to grow, the things that you want to see yourself improve with. You can do this as an individual. You can do this as a parent. And you can do this for your child. And one of the things I would strongly suggest is to get your kids out of, especially the older kids, out of the mindset of academic growth only. We focus a lot on that in schools, but when you're thinking about growth mindset, it should really be more about social and emotional growth, and these things that are not spelling and reading and math, because all spelling and reading math are just a bunch of abilities we have in the brain put towards those different subjects. So here we really want to build those basic skills.
Great. Can you give us an example of how you would deploy this glow and grow mindset in your practice?
Yeah, so I work with a lot of families, and one of the number one things, as I mentioned a little bit before, is about doing this yourself
Mhm.
as the parent. So we often lose ourselves when we raise kids, and honestly, we do this sometimes as teachers as well. And so what we really want to do is identify who we are. Who are you as a mom? Forget actually even the mom part. Who are you first? And once you really can identify that and you're insightful and you have a sense of how you think and feel and what's important to you and what your values are, you can then take this and do this for your child. They can do it for themselves. And you can also kind of mirror these two things and help them a lot. And so, though that's two steps, right? The third step would then be identifying who you are as a parent and what your values are as a parent. And that's really important. So, we have three different steps that we use in my practice to really help to make sure that we are taking care of every piece. Because when you let one piece fall, then the rest do. When you don't know who you are, you can't be effective as a parent because you don't have, you're not modeling that sense of core values. You're not modeling that insight. So in my practice, I really focus a lot on helping parents go back and identify who they are and practice this for themselves so that they can then help their children through that as well.
Great. And how can we help our children to develop emotional intelligence?
So emotional intelligence is really about insight. So it's about understanding, again, who we are, how we feel, and what we value, and then extending that interpretation to others, right? So once we know how to do this for ourselves, we can then do this for other people in the world. So we can help kids develop emotional intelligence by working on this growth mindset approach for ourselves first, and then modeling that at home and at school, and really helping to create these happy, connected little brains. I mentioned that in the very beginning because that's what starts to exude this emotional intelligence. And when we are teaching these kids to identify their strengths and weaknesses through a chart like a Glow and Grow, that we're also modeling ourselves, now this gives us this opportunity to work on the way kids think, to help them start to frame their emotions in a positive way and encourage them to reframe negative thoughts and to really further develop that emotional intelligence. And then, for us as parents too, it helps us really kind of have this guide as to how are we going to intervene with our children and how are we going to help them kind of become more independent in emotional intelligence skills instead of just dictating what they should and shouldn't be doing. We want them to start to think for themselves. And that's a whole different approach.
Yeah, and do you find that it's difficult for children to have emotional intelligence?
I think that this is a matter of modeling again. There are some kids that are kind of more innately can see kind of the problems in things and how things can go wrong. Sometimes these are your anxious kids, your more anxious kids, or even your more intelligent kids who can see more problems than they should for their age potentially. And I say should, but I mean than most kids do for their age. But I think about when it comes to positive emotions, it's about a model of showing kids, yes, it's okay to feel certain things, and then helping them to reframe the negative thoughts that they might be having in the world.
Great. And let's talk about some everyday brain hacks. How
Yes.
does our brain change to support learning?
Well, we teach our brain how to respond, right? So we can lay the pathways by connecting that old and new learning that we talked about. So we can actually change the way the brain is connected through our learning process and kind of vice versa. So we get to decide how to lay those pathways with our kids through example and through modeling. And we can do it for ourselves by really making conscious efforts to identify our areas of growth and target those and intentionally make change. Habit forming, right? If we can create more positive habits, that's just the brain learning how to do something in a different way. That's how we make those pathways and connections, is by creating these intentionally starting to think and behave in different ways. It's kind of that fake it until you make it concept. The reason that came out is because that's really a brain trick. You smile, you just make an intentional effort to smile, and you will eventually start to feel happier because your brain gets used to that behavior. And you can do that across skills and across any activity you want to do.
This just came to me, when you're studying in prep school, primary school, or high school, or even university, they always encouraged us to study and maintain everything in our long-term memory. But sometimes we realize that it's only like in our short-term memory. So how would you encourage us to make sure things stick in our long-term memory when we're studying? And also, how can we help our children to store things in their long-term memory?
Yeah, so I'm laughing because my mom used to say, just put all your books under your pillow and you'll learn. But I think, although I'm not sure that trick will work, the idea of being able to study over periods of time, because now you're taking your old learning, you're attaching new learning to it, then you're giving some time and space, you've come a little bit further. Now you're going to attach newer learning to it, and your understanding and depth, the depth at which you understand that material becomes more. When that happens, you can pull it a lot easier. But also sleep is a big helper too. And I always interpret what she says in that way, which is that if you study over periods of time, that will create a depth to your learning. It also creates kind of this, our brain does like predictability and routine and consistency. So the more you review something, the more it kind of pulls that pathway to the top. It says, okay, well, we're going to keep using this stuff. So we better kind of make sure we learn it a little bit more. Let's keep this at the top of our list. When you do something right before the test, that is an in and out thing. That is a short-term memory thing that will leave you very quickly. And look, sometimes in school, there's reasons to do that.
Yeah.
But for things that you really want to learn and absorb and be able to kind of incorporate into what you know, you have to do that over the long term. And then sleep, because what that sleep does is it consolidates your learning. It's almost like a filing process that happens. It takes everything that happened that day, everything you've learned, and puts it in these file drawers, and organizes everything. That's actually why we sometimes get funny dreams, because this information kind of crosses as it gets filed, and you just kind of have that perception. Remember, your brain is creating these perceptions. And so it's just kind of perception crossing at night. And so you sometimes get this funky dream about Bob, who was at the grocery store and then ended up in a magical land with elephants. It just kind of all gets crossed that way.
Thanks for clarifying. I really love it. And now that you've mentioned about sleep, I'm sure there are more things that would make our brain thrive. So can you share a bit more on this?
Yeah. So I always like to talk about healthy brain habits in general. The neat thing is that the food we mentioned sleep, which is important, but the food we eat, it turns into the chemicals that your brain uses for power. I'm going to say that one more time, because it was crazy to me when I finally realized this. The food that you eat, everything that you consume, turns into the chemicals that your brain uses to function. That's pretty cool. And so when you think about things your brain needs to thrive, a good healthy diet is really one of them, because we can actually break down the diet and look at each individual component and what it's going to do for your brain. So we can eat certain things for extra energy. We can eat certain things for mood stabilization. We can eat certain things to improve kind of our efficiency and effectiveness. And so really one of the main things for our brain to thrive is a healthy diet. Good sleep. Remember, it does that consolidation process, and we need that. It cleanses also. We used to think that the brain shut down during sleep, which is so interesting. But now we've actually seen some animal studies where our brain sits inside the skull in fluid called cerebral spinal fluid. And when it sits in that fluid for protection, but also kind of it has a pressurized system that moves it through. And when you sleep, that system actually goes into high gear, and it will increase the movement of that fluid. And so you really have this cleansing effect that happens, and it gets rid of all the trash and debris that's in the extracellular space within the brain. And so when you do that, you actually have this cleansing. I mentioned the filing, but even from a chemical standpoint and from a cell standpoint, you get a cleansing effect. The other thing that does that is exercise. So exercise will also not only kind of cleanse the brain, it kind of helps promote that movement, but you also get some extra growth hormones as well. And so you will stimulate the growth hormone in your brain. And so you get the development of new connections and new cells that way as well. And so I would say, exercise, these basic healthy habits that we say are healthy for the world, remember brain rule, life rule, are also helpful for our brains. So sleep, eating, healthy eating, exercise. And then I would add one more, which would be just practicing this healthy brain habit of thinking in a growth mindset form, because that also is kind of your boom, boom, boom kind of how do I help my brain thrive? Those would be the targets.
Great. And what about doing crossword puzzles?
Well, yeah, anytime you use your brain, it's going to be helpful. So that you're really kind of keeping yourself sharp, and those kinds of things are also fun. Not a necessary requirement for your brain to function, but remember, everything that you start to do, it starts to help your brain realize what's important and what kind of outputs you need to do. So if you need to if you need to think in that way where you have a problem and you have to find the solution to it, something like a crossword puzzle is good. If you need to think more mathematically, doing more mathematically based problems would be good on a more daily basis. If you need to think more socially, looking at more social situations would be good. So kind of using the things that you need for your brain to thrive.
Great. And what strategies are you implementing on your parenting journey to raise happy, healthy, and emotionally intelligent children?
Wine, mostly wine. No, I'm just kidding. Although wine can be good for your brain. No, really here it's about that insight. For me, that's the primary thing with my kids in terms of helping to make their brains happy and healthy and connected. It's really about thinking about how you're thinking.
Yeah.
And that is really the primary goal in my household. And you can ask my kids, who I probably drive crazy with this, but it's a lot of what I would call reflective questioning, which is, how did you approach that? Why did you do that? How did we get there? What could we do differently next time? And those kinds of questions, instead of saying, you shouldn't do this, or I need you to, this promotes their brain to think about these things and make those connections on their own. So asking questions as a parent, and really being that reflective in that way, promotes that insight, and it promotes that connectedness in the brain. It helps the kids develop these skills for themselves. So for me, primarily, that's the most important for my kids.
Great. And one question though, you mentioned this reflective questioning, but at what age would you recommend that parents start with this reflective questioning?
That's a good question. I think it's a good strategy across the board, for every age. And it's a good habit to get into, just asking instead of telling your kids, just asking questions. So even a young child who wants a cup, wants something to drink, right? They waddle over to you and they put the cup up, and you can say, what would you like? How could you get that?
Yeah.
Could you use your words, or even where would we find the juice? Right. And they could say, they either point or say, depending on their language skills at the time, the fridge. Great. Yes, we would find this in the fridge, Oh, are you so happy? Mommy gave you some juice. How could you show me you were happy? Oh, I love hugs. Thank you so much for giving me a hug. Just even at that very basic level, you can do that all the way up through. Okay, well, we've done a lot to reorganize our entire day to take you to a million soccer and hockey and all of these, activities for a day. How could you show somebody that you appreciated that, as for an older kid? So.
And the teenagers, because sometimes they get a bit strained. So how do you deal with those?
Yeah, I think it's about, first of all, for teenagers, helping to understand hormonally what's happening with their development is very key, to help them understand that they will feel like things are the end of the world. And that is normal and that is natural, but to encourage them to be able to see the evidence that over the course of time, they'll come out of those feelings a little bit, I think is really, really key for teenagers. And for teenagers too, it's as simple as, I would like you to be respectful and be a contributing member of this household. How could you do that? How could you show me that? And they can tell you what they should do within the household. But I also think it's about helping them make a bunch of connections and recognizing the strong impact, especially for teenage girls, that their feelings and their emotions driven by hormones is going to have on their behavior and their cognitions, because that insight is going to be really essential for them to be able to continue to make good decisions throughout that period in their life and then beyond.
Yes, this is very useful information for parents, because we need to understand that first so that we can help our children to thrive. Thank you
Yes,
so much.
you're very welcome.
Thank you. So tell me now, how can people reach you, Sarah?
So the best way to figure out what's happening with me right now is to go to my website, which is brainbehaviorbridge.com. I have a book coming out in electronically in the beginning of May, and then in print in the middle of May. So that's another way. It's called Raising Brains. So that would be another way to read me. And if you actually, or to reach me, and if you go to my website, you can get on my email list. And then of course you can reach me on social media. You can reach me on LinkedIn at brainbehaviorbridge.com. And Facebook also at brainbehaviorbridge.com. And then Instagram at dr.sarah, SARAH, Allen, ALLEN. And I'd be happy to chat with you.
Thank you so much. You gave us such enlightening information. We really appreciate the information that you shared. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And I have some new resources for teachers also. So if you're a parent and a teacher, just a teacher looking to help raise brains too, I have a course coming out for that, as well as a big parent course about raising brains as well.
Great. Thanks for sharing. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in on Experts Connect. Please head on over to teachsomebody.com and give us an applause. You may share your comments and ask your questions in the comment section. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, as well as follow us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. You can also follow me on Instagram at Davis-Owusu. Have a lovely rest of the week. Bye.